Good morning, all. Welcome to the 10th webinar series, 10th of the webinar series that the Alumni Association of the Faculty of Agriculture has organized. And we welcome you once again to this particular event where the AAFAUP has been organizing for quite some time right now. Though we underwent a lull period, I must tell you, due to logistical reasons, where we could not meet you at your homes at 7 p.m. during the past because of logistical reasons. Here we are once again with you talking about the subjects of national importance. And before I start introducing the resource person today, let me now invite the president of the AAFAUP for the year 2023-2024, Dr. Tushara Wickramaratche, to speak a few words. And Dr. Wickramaratche is the person who gave the initiative for this series of importance. Dr. Wickramaratche, over to you.
Hello, good evening. Can everybody hear me properly?
Yeah, good evening,
Because
Dr. Wickramaratche. We hear you loud and clear.
Yes. Welcome to all alumni members as well as all the participants today for our 10th webinar. Our apology as the Alumni Association for short break we took since February to get this 10th webinar, because we wanted to have the resource person from other institution. That is why we took little time to get the best the speakers from other institution for you to create the good platform for sharing the latest agriculture knowledge. Today we are privileged to have Professor Dharmakeerthi. He is going to talk about the biochar, potential of the biochar. We are very happy today's forum. Many soil scientists we can see over the line, and thank you, Mapasa. Mapasa also joined today. Then it is encouraging for us to have this type of the important webinars in future also. With this, without taking much time, I will hand over everything to the Professor Buddhimarambe. Sir, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wickramaratche, and thank you once again on behalf of the Alumni Association of the Faculty of Agriculture at University of Peradeniya for this initiative. As Dr. Wickramaratche said, colleagues, the first 9 events that we had in this webinar series were conducted by the expertise that we extracted out of the Department of Agriculture on many important topics of national interest to solve day-to-day issues in certain cases, but with a scientific background. The 10th event that we are having today is the very first time that we have decided, the Alumni Association, to invite personnel expertise outside the Department of Agriculture. And I'm happy that the AAFAUP has decided to get hold of Professor Dharmakeerthi, a veteran in the subject of biochar, an experienced campaigner in soil science, to address certain specific issues with respect to this important subject. Before I start, I'm not going to give a detailed introduction about Professor Dharmakeerthi, but I would like to let you know, because there was a gap in our presentations from the 9th event to the 10th webinar, I must let you know the modality and on how we conducted this seminar series. Please do keep in mind, this webinar is a structured one. In other words, the moderator and the speaker have got together and decided on the key issues faced by the industry, practitioners, scientists on a particular subject, and identifying the issues while addressing those things during the presentation. So you will note that the presentation has a flow when Professor Dharmakeerthi presents, but I will chip in with several questions so that the audience will be in a position to understand the flow and also understand and to learn about certain scientific backgrounds, certain scientific context, and also solutions to some of the problems and some of the thoughts that people have with respect to this subject. And at the end of the session, you will not be allowed, unfortunately, to speak or ask questions verbally, but I always welcome you to post your question in the chat box so that at the end of the presentation, I will take the liberty in forwarding those questions to the speaker, Professor Dharmakeerthi. And that will be the mode of operation. So I kindly request all the participants to mute their microphones and make use of the chat box in order to pass messages as well as to ask questions from the speaker. And that, as the moderator, I will be commanding the questions or the queries that you have to Professor Dharmakeerthi at the end of the presentation. So with that short note, let me now formally invite Professor R.S. Dharmakeerthi, Professor Dharmakeerthi, as we affectionately know him, from the Department of Soil Science, Faculty of Agriculture, University of Peradeniya, to speak about biochar. And he has opted for the topic called a panacea for all soil fertility ailments, with a question mark. Professor Dharmakeerthi, let me put forward the first question to you with this interesting subject. Of course, the title is a question, and as the members will now know, we are trying to find solutions for this question. Professor Dharmakeerthi, before we start moving ahead, we have to bring all the experience as well as new members who are joining this webinar series and the subject of soil science. We have to bring them into a common platform, not to challenge their intellectual capacities and abilities, but let's see, everybody is in the common platform so that we can continue this session. My first question to you, Professor Dharmakeerthi, what is actually biochar? I mean, people are talking a lot about biochar. A lot of discussions are going on. As your title says, a lot of people think it is the solution for all our problems. But it's good to know what biochar is. And also let us know that, is it a new technology? As some people look like they have invented certain things and trying to present in such a way that people have just found something new to solve our problems? Or has it been over there for a long period of time and people are using it? Professor Dharmakeerthi, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Marambe, for that brief introduction. And also thank you, AAFAUP, Alumni Association of the Faculty of Agriculture, for inviting me to deliver this presentation at their 10th webinar series. 10th webinar of a series of webinars that they have conducted. And thank you very much, and good evening to all the online participants. And it is a pleasure to talk to you about one of the pet subjects, I would say, that I have researched in the last decade or so. With that, then I hope that you all can hear me very well and also can see my slides. I will put my slides into presentation mode. Let me start my presentation. I have some issues with the slides I have started. Oops. If there's a problem with my slides, just hold on for a sec. I have this issue for quite a few times now.
Members attending, please bear with us. There's a technical hitch. I'm sure we can sort it out quickly. Please bear with us.
Okay. I'm not very sure about why my hard drive is not reading.
Professor Dharmakeerthi, you can switch off your video so that you can make the arrangements done and then later switch it on.
Sure, thank you. Luminda. I'm back. I hope that you can hear me.
Yeah, glad to see and hear you once again. Go ahead, please go ahead.
Thank you. And my apologies for that little mishap. And yes, the questions that Professor Marby was asking is, what is actually biochar and whether it is a new technology? If I still remember your questions correctly. And let's have a look at first what is actually biochar. What I mean by biochar. So biochar is kind of a solid material, I would say, and obtained by heating organic materials under limited or no oxygen conditions, a process called pyrolysis for soil application. So the term biochar was specifically designed when we use this solid black color material that has been generated for pyrolysis, from pyrolysis, when it is being used as a soil amendment. That is how the word biochar first initiated. And there are very important point to remember is that these organic materials are heated under zero oxygen conditions, normally under very controlled conditions, but sometimes you will have a very limited volume of oxygen in it, as you cannot completely make do away with oxygen. So it is a black color solid material obtained by heating organic materials. So for that matter, any organic material under limited or no oxygen conditions. So that is what I mean by biochar. And the second question is whether this is a new technology. And in fact, it was not a new technology per se. And it had been there in the world for 2,500 years ago or so, but we discovered this sort of a situation later, and we observed the effects of biochar, or we realized the effects of biochar only later stages. So in the Brazilian Amazon forest, people saw these kind of soil profiles when they walk around the Amazon forest, particularly by Europeans. And they saw that in one place you have kind of a very infertile soil, and on the other hand, right adjacent to it, you have this dark colored soil profiles, right? And they also noticed that the crops that were growing in these two profiles were very poor in infertile or kind of light colored soils, whereas the crops or plants were growing very well in these dark colored soil profiles. So they called it terra preta di Indio, meaning that the black earth of the Indians. So that is how the name derived, black earth of the earth, black earth of the Indians. So black earth was there in the past in many different places in the world, but these particular soils have been either intentionally or unintentionally was created by the Indians who lived in the Amazon forest, like Incas and Mayas. So some 500 to 2,000 years ago. So in there, they identified there are some black color materials that have been developed, that had been added to these things, to these soils by Incas and Mayas, right? And then in 1940s and 60s, people who came to Amazon forest from the European, they brought that idea back to their countries. And in 1990s and towards 2000, only we really wanted to investigate what were the properties in those soils. And they found that there are something called a black charred material in these soil profiles that made it into charcoal, into that black color. So that is how this has been evolved in the past. So it is not new technology in the very first place, but it was there for 2,000 odd years. But we try to understand what it is in the late 1990s or at the very beginning of the 2000, at the incept of 21st century. So from that point, I think we can say that the particular technology was investigated and tried to understand recently, and that is how it evolved in this couple of decades or so.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Dharmakeerthi. Though we had a technical glitch, as I told you at the very beginning, I'm sure the simple and clear presentation that you made in response to my two questions that I asked, I think it has made clear in people's mind, and I'm sure the gloominess that we had in our mind for the technical hitch, I'm sure that has been cleared right now. It's true, as you quite correctly said, biochar is not a new technology. So let's all understand that aspect. But we have started learning more about it because every day we started learning newest things in science. That's the important part. So Professor Dharmakeerthi, with your vast experience in this particular field as well, what properties of biochar have made it unique and so special in this overall affair? Over to you, Professor Dharmakeerthi.
Okay, and let's have a look at some of the biochars that people have trying to prepare since year 2000 or so. And these are some of the biochars that I myself produced when I was a scientist at the Rubber Research Institute. So I prepared these biochar under limited or no oxygen conditions from rubber wood, paddy husk, a cover crop called Mucuna bracteata, Mucuna slashings, and corn cobs, right? When you have a very close look at it, you will see the difference, right? And to your left-hand side, there's an electron micrograph image showing a poultry litter before we subject it to pyrolysis, the process that will convert poultry litter into biochar, right? And when we convert it or when we heat it, you will see the difference in structure of the poultry litter that was originally there, right? And the obvious thing is in biochar, it is that is the poultry litter biochar that I made is in your right hand side. And what is unique about that is you can see quite a lot of small pores in it. And because of this, this is an image I got from a rubber wood biochar. Almost in all those biochars, there are very specific properties like very small pores space, and they are very highly porous material, and therefore it has a very unique and very high specific surface area. And it has a these surfaces are charged with negative and positive charges, and therefore they have a very high charge density. And resistant to decomposition is one of the characteristics of converting biomass to through thermochemical reactions to biochar, and the carbon that is in their aromatic carbon, they are resistant to decomposition, and also that is one of the other property. And this biochar is high in nutrients like particularly potassium, magnesium, and calcium, and people have observed that there's relatively higher proportion of phosphorus as well when compared to the original biomass. So these are some of the properties that made biochar is unique. And when you look at the biochar has therefore 4 different components of it. Some are stable carbon, which is shown in this darker 70% of also in the pie chart. And then there's unstable carbon as well, a little bit of unstable carbon. And you have ash because of the thermal conversion. And also when you expose it to air, it has the capacity to absorb some water vapor, and therefore water is in there. So if you look at the stable carbon, as I mentioned, they are related to how long they remain in the soil because they are not palatable to microorganisms or will not be decomposed easily. And unstable carbon, which is somewhere around 5%, roughly speaking, and they are readily decomposed and contain volatile matter and can influence plant nutrition. And ash component is the one that is rich in cations, and therefore it has a very high pH and can provide plant nutrients as well. And if you have very high amount of ash during the process of making biochar, it could sometimes be harmful to plant, particularly the emerging seedlings. And there's quite a lot of moisture, even though you don't realize it. About 20, 30, 40% of biochar, when you export it to air, it contains moisture in it. And properties of biochar varies with the way that we prepare biochar, right? The biomass that we use, pyrolysis temperature at which this biochar is made, and heating rate, residence time, and pressure in the reactor. So when you have different pyrolysis conditions together with different types of biomass, you can produce a vast array of different biochar with different properties in it, right? If I give you some information about how temperature would affect certain properties of biochar, you can see that the pH of the biochar material will increase as the temperature increases, and the amount of carbon that is present in the biochar will decrease when you increase the pH, increase the temperature. And when you increase the temperature from 400 to say 600 or so, the surface area of the biochar shorts up and then remains relatively constant. And more importantly, for us, for soil managers, and cation exchange capacity, I said that there's a very high charge density in it, and therefore the cation exchange capacity increases as the temperature of the biochar increases. So when we have different pyrolysis conditions, particularly in this case temperature, you can see different types of biochar is produced. And to give you some information about different types of biochar that I have made in the past. So I made use rubber wood as a raw material and produce biochar using two different pyrolysis conditions. One was at around 600 degrees Celsius and the other one was around 350. Similarly, I made some biochar using corn cobs using the same two techniques, and you can see there are differences in the properties that I have measured. Organic carbon content relatively high in rubber wood and low in corn cobs. And then when you look at the nutrients, potassium, magnesium, and calcium in it, they are also vary. Particularly magnesium concentration is high in rubber wood biochar compared to corn cob biochar, right? And usually pH is very high in biochar, but you can make biochar with low pH as well, depending on the starting raw material that you use, right? And the higher the temperature, the higher the cation exchange capacity would be. And at lower temperatures, you have a relatively low cation exchange capacity, as I showed in the previous slide. So, depending on the raw material that we use and the pyrolysis conditions, you will clearly see we have different types of biochar, meaning that not all biochars are the same biochar, right? So,
yeah, Thank you very much, Professor Dharmakeerthi. I mean, the diversity in biochar, that's something that we have to keep in mind always, as Professor Dharmakeerthi quite correctly mentioned and eloquently presented, giving facts and figures. Professor Dharmakeerthi, now, I mean, when you look at what's happening in the recent past, especially when it comes to agriculture, let me take an example from paddy, which is our main staple. It is recommended that we should use partially burnt paddy husk for paddy to get a better yield and so on. And there's some confusions, misconceptions. Before I go further, I think this is high time, after knowing what biochar is and after knowing the properties of biochar, knowing the diversity of biochar, can you please shed light on the issue with respect to biochar and partially burnt paddy husk? Are they the same or different, and in what context? Over to you, Professor Dharmakeerthi.
Right. I think that is a very good question, Professor Marambe. I think people were using partially burnt paddy husk and thinking that with this new technology that is being emerged in the last 1 or 2 decades ago, and they were trying to see whether this biochar technology and the way that we were using some partially burned paddy husk, whether we would get the same effect, or is it the two technologies, two materials that we have are the same? And in my mind, it is not the same. So these are two images that I collected from, to your left-hand side, that is partially burned paddy husk. And then in your right-hand side is an image of a rice husk biochar. So partially burned paddy husk and rice husk biochar. So these two are, when you look at it, you will see that the difference in it. In partially burned paddy husk, there are material that has not been converted into biochar or charcoal particles or black solid particles, right? That is the definition that we go by, right? So partially burned paddy husk and the biochar are two different things. And in fact, in order to get some better idea about it, we say that heat treatment of raw materials or organic materials, they come to a continuum of different types of charcoal or charred material, right? So when we say that pyrogenic carbon content is the carbon that has been converted to more aromatic type of carbon, and you can see to your left-hand side and in here, the pyrogenic carbon contents are very low. When you do not have any heat treatment, then almost everything is in non-pyrogenic carbon, right? And the pyrogenic carbon content increases steadily as you convert your raw material into black carbon or soot, and finally under geothermal conversions to graphite, right? So it is the same organic substance. When we subject it to different thermochemical reactions, they will convert ultimately to graphite, right? So charcoal sits in between black carbon and the raw material, and the partially burned paddy husk is somewhere near to the original material. And therefore, the characteristics are completely different in the two products that we use, right? And particularly when you look at the organic to carbon ratio and hydrogen to carbon ratios of partially burned paddy husk, they are normally high compared to the biochar materials that I have, right? Therefore, partially burned paddy husk will decompose faster than the biochar material that we produce. They will be there in the soil for about hundreds or thousands of years from the recent past, the investigations that sort of confirm that some of the material that were there in the Amazon forest were about 6,000 to 8,000 years of age, right? So we don't get that, but you have some converted biochar particles in partially burned paddias, and they will last long as well, right? But even though their chemical nature is now different because of these have been created with the oxygen in the environment. So therefore, the chemical properties of partially burned paddias is different from what is in the charcoal.
Thank you very much, Professor Dharmakeerthi. As I told you at the very beginning, this webinar series comprise structured webinars, structured seminars on the other hand. So we have to understand that everyone, that we are trying to solve certain issues in the society, and of course trying to find solution to scientific issues that we face, and also to create a good mindset and good understanding among people about the subject area. That's why we collectively had decided to put forward these questions to the expert and get response from the expert himself so that the issues can be sorted out easily. Well, Professor Dharmakeerthi, every time when we speak of biochar, partially burnt paddy husk, or fertilizer, for example, the soil fertility issues come up, whether we are using fertilizers, soil amendment, soil conditioners, whatever we add to the soil. Soil fertility is the subject that comes up to the surface always, trying to link all the inputs that we have in the system. So before I move further, I think we have to change gears here and come back to another basic question that I'm going to ask from you. Soil fertility is a subject, Professor Dharmakeerthi, as you all know. It's been talked very high, especially with respect to land productivity, crop productivity, and so on. Can you please let us know, though people speak of soil fertility, how do we define, or what is meant by this special term called soil fertility? And also, can you let us know what are the main soil fertility issues in Sri Lanka so that we can come back to the biochar issue once again. Over to you, Professor Dharmakeerthi.
Okay, thank you, Professor Marambe. I think if we are to go through this presentation, I think you wanted to get a clarification from me about the what is biochar, and also it is equally important for us to get to know about what actually meant by fertility, right? Is it? I know that many people use that term in ad hoc manner, but in order to understand the context of this presentation, I think it's very prudent that we need to have a very clear understanding of what is meant by soil fertility, right? So to me, soil fertility has, if I ask from some ordinary people, what is soil fertility? They will say that the capacity of a soil to provide plant nutrients, right? So in the Soil Science Society of America definition, soil fertility says potential capacity of a soil to provide nutrients, right? But it goes a little bit beyond that, and it says not just the capacity to provide nutrients, but it has to be provided, the soil should be able to provide nutrients in forms that plant can absorb, in quantities that plant requires, and in ratios of different ratios that required for the normal growth of a specific plant or a crop. So that is the definition given by Soil Science Society of America, and therefore it is not just merely saying that providing nutrients is the soil fertility. So there are three specific terms that I have highlighted: forms, quantities, and balanced ratios of different nutrients, right? And also this fertility varies from crop to crop. Even though the same soil, when you grow different crops, you have different soil fertility levels that suits the plant requirement. So this is the broad soil fertility concept that we need to keep in mind. And recently in 2015, Food and Agriculture Organization goes a little beyond that. And when defining soil fertility, and it says the ability of a soil to sustain growth by providing essential nutrients. So it is essentially the same as providing nutrients, but it adds several other things into that. Favorable chemical, physical, and biological characteristics in the soil so that the plant can have a better habitat for plant growth. And more importantly, the capacity of the soil to maintain the ecosystem services, right? So this is a very broad concept of soil fertility. But at least if we stick to what is given by the Soil Science Society of America, so we need to keep in mind that forms, quantities, and ratios are important when we try to address soil fertility issues. So what are the soil fertility issues that we have anyway in most of Sri Lankan soils? To give you very quickly, most of our soils have been eroded, and I know that about 60% of the arable lands have been eroded. And in one article, I read that about 1 inch, 1 foot, meaning that 30 centimeters of topsoil have been already eroded from plantation crop areas, right? In the wet zone of Sri Lanka. It is like you are removing your skin and exposing to adverse other conditions, right? And so that is a very first thing. So our fertile soil is in the topsoil and it has been eroded, right? And resulting that most of these lands are, or soils are sandy to loamy sand soils. And that is not only due to erosion, but also due to the long weathering processes of parent materials that we have. Rocks and minerals weathering over 3-4 millions of years, right? And because of the erosion and the sandy nature, the water holding capacity is very low, and therefore the plant soil has the limited capacity to provide a good habitat for plant growth. If we go by FAO definition, right? Then we have very low available plant nutrients. When I say very low, it means quantity, and also then we have different proper ratios as well. And poor in nutrient holding capacity, right? It is because of the low clay content in most of our soils, and the type of clay is also different, and therefore poor quality clay minerals like kaolinites, hydroxides, amorphous minerals like that, and also very low organic matter content, right? So very key, very important thing is about the fertility of our soils is very low organic matter content. Most of the organic matter is in the topsoil. When the topsoil is eroded, then organic matter goes. And because of very harsh weather conditions like high temperatures and high humidity, whatever the remaining is also decomposing fast under agricultural practice. Therefore, we have very low organic matter content. And also, most of our wet zone soils have acidic nature in it, and therefore, sometimes they are extremely acidic, particularly in the areas where the plantation crops are grown, right? And the other thing is, so these properties, whatever the soil fertility properties that we measure, they are highly variable across different parts of the Sri Lanka. Therefore, you will realize that you need to have different approaches for different places in Sri Lanka, right? So at least we have 120 soil series or associations, and that is the minimum right now at the moment. So they are highly variable as well, right? So most of our soil are like this, what is in your right-hand side top, but what we imagine is to get a soil that are in the right-hand bottom, right?
Thank you very much, Professor Dharmakeerthi. Not only the biochar is diverse, depending on the material that we use. You can look at the content of the organic matter, soil organic matter, and the other characteristics of the soils in Sri Lanka that highlights very clearly that one simple solution cannot solve all our problems. So let me come back to the biochar issue right now after looking at the soil fertility. So my question is now, after knowing about biochar, knowing about the soil fertility and the condition in Sri Lanka, as many people think, many people I have heard in different forums, people are talking, can biochar solve these fertility problems? That's a question. If so, can you provide some evidence for that, Professor Dharmakeerthi? Over to you.
Okay. So what we have sort of discussed so far is that the biochar itself is very variable in properties, and the soil itself is highly variable. And therefore, we do not have, I think, theoretically, we cannot have one solution for all the problems that we encounter, right? But biochar is a unique product, right? And it has some properties that people tend to believe that it is a miracle material sometimes, right? It is like a coconut tree, what we call kapruka, for example. It has many uses of it. Biochar is also the same. It can use in many different situations, but whether that will solve all the problems in that particular soil, that we need to investigate, right? So I'll give you some evidence for that, right? Biochar, of course, improves soil fertility. It improves soil fertility, and it can improve soil physical properties, water holding capacity, and there are literature that it will promote soil aggregation, saturated hydraulic conductivity, and therefore the infiltration rate. How much of water will go into the soil will be improved because of application of biochar. And when it comes to chemical properties of a soil, cation exchange capacity can be increased, pH can be increased in the soil. If the soil is very acidic, then you can raise the pH. And available cations, when we talk about the plant nutrients, potassium, calcium, magnesium like cations, their availability can be improved because biochar has it, right? And there are sometimes, because of this capacity to have very high charge surfaces, it can also retain some toxins or toxic chemicals in the biochar so that they will not be bioavailable, right? And literature also suggests that not only physical and chemical properties, biological properties will also improve, and nitrogen fixation, for example, will be increased. Some of the vesicular, arbuscular, microbial associations in soil have been reported to be improved, and therefore the phosphorus uptake has been improved in biochar amended soils. And microbial activity, because of this highly porous nature of biochar, and it can hold more water, microbes can have a very good habitat for their growth, and therefore the microbial activity can also be improved. Now, these are some of the suggestions in the literature that people have observed, right? So, yes, in specific occasions, in specific soils, these things can happen. Whether how and why and when this will happen always is a question, right? And let's look at some of the results that I have from Sri Lankan soils, right? Now, this is from a rubber growing soil when I was at the Rubber Research Institute, Pallegoda series near Kalutara, right? So we increased the rates of biochar application from 0, no biochar application, to 2% of the soil weight, right? When you increase the biochar rate, the pH, organic carbon content, and the CEC, the cation exchange capacity has been improved significantly, right? Whether it will solve all the problems related to phosphorus, pH, organic carbon, or CEC is a question, because when you look at the pH 4.51 and it has increased to 5.91, right? And organic carbon content, when we say that we need to have at least 2.5 to 3% of organic carbon for optimum growth, or to have a very good fertile soil, we can only increase up to 1.14% in this particular case, right? And when we look at the cation exchange capacity, for example, to have a cation exchange capacity somewhere close to 15 centimoles per kilogram is the kind of a better cation exchange capacity in a fertile soil. Even with when we apply 2% of biochar, we have not been able to achieve this in this situation. So this is rubber wood biochar. To remind you, this 2% means roughly about 40 tons of biochar per hectare, right? Even if you apply 40 tons of biochar, we were not able to achieve the sort of ideal cation exchange capacity, for example, ideal organic carbon content in that particular soil, right? So that is one situation. So magnitude vary with the rate of biochar is the take-home message from this slide. This is from a laboratory incubation study that has been carried out by Professor Mapa, and also I think Dumindo also involved in it. And when we have biochar levels increases steadily, the water holding capacity, or the amount of water that retain in the soil under different suction conditions, will improve. So as you can see, when you do not have biochar is sitting here, when you apply 5% biochar, you have a very high water content remaining. But you see again, how much you apply determines how much increase you get, right? For example, 1% biochar has a very marginal increase. So if you want to get a significant increase, then you have to have higher rates, right? So rate of biochar affects water retention capacity again, right? Then I'm going to show you some situations where soil property that will affect the change in pH, what we call pH buffer capacity. If a soil has a high pH buffer capacity, it will resist the changes in pH. For example, if you apply quite a lot of nitrogen fertilizers to tea plantations, and tea soil acidification will be reduced. Rate of tea soil acidification will be reduced if you can increase the pH buffer capacity, right? Now I have used two different soils, reddish brown earth soil from the dry zone and red yellow podzolic from the wet zone, right? And I have applied two different types of biochar, rubber wood and rice husk, right? When you do not apply biochar, this is not an issue. The take-home message is RYP, the pH buffer capacity is low, and RBE, pH buffer capacity high, right? But when you apply 2% biochar, in reddish brown earth soils, the pH buffer capacity did not change. But in red yellow podzolic soils, it changes, right? It reduces the pH buffer capacity, right? No, rather, I beg your pardon. When you apply 2% of biochar for reddish red yellow podzolic soils, pH buffer capacity has increased from here to here, right? And also, when you apply rice husk biochar, it also increases. But the difference is depend on the type of biochar that you use, right? But the take-home messages is impact of biochar vary with the soil type and also the biochar type. So in one soil, biochar will work, and in the other soil, the biochar will not work if you apply the same rates, right? And again, very quickly, I will go through some other data as well very quickly. This is how it improves the growth of rubber nursery plants, right? Application of biochar has increased the nursery growth of the nursery plants, but you can see that we have applied only nitrogen and magnesium in both situations, where phosphorus and potassium have not been applied. But when you apply biochar, because it has quite a lot of cations in it, it provides potassium and magnesium, potassium and phosphorus, and therefore it has improved the growth, right? And that is where very important for us to remember that biochar has quite a lot of potassium in it, and if you apply biochar at very high rates, you have applying very high rates of potassium, and it will impair the balance between potassium and magnesium in the plants. So when we increase the biochar application, it will reduce the magnesium uptake from the soil. So you need to be very careful about the application of biochar in different crop situations, right? We can reduce phosphorus and potassium application in order to keep that balance in the nutrient ratios, right? And this is another beautiful finding that Amrita Lovajanan from Eastern University, from the northern part, one of my graduate students, he prepared some rice husk biochar and applied at different rates, 0.5% to 2%, and observed the increase in plant growth or the yield of onion in the presence of biochar, right? And what he observed is, and the take-home message is also that this yellow kind of line is only NPK fertilizers in 2 seasons, right? And when you apply biochar, when you apply NPK fertilizers in yellow season, the yield has not been increased, but in the Maha season, but in yellow season it has increased. So there's differences in seasons as well in the application of biochar. It is in one hand. On the other hand, when you do not apply biochar, application of fertilizers is giving you higher yields always, right? When you apply only biochar, then without any fertilizers, they will have lower rates. So in other words, application of biochar will increase the crop yields, and that vary with the season, rate of application, and also the quantity, whether you apply synthetic fertilizers or not. So alone biochar, it will not work. And this is another similar in line. Upekshani, one of my grad students again, she conducted this in the upcountry vegetable cultivating areas. She did it for 4 seasons, right? And when you have biochar plus fertilizers added together, you get the highest yield, right? When you have only the nitrogen NPK fertilizers or only biochar, you always have lower yield. So therefore, it provides that you need to have some additional nutrients coming in to get the higher yields. So in other words, biochar cannot solve that fertility issue in that particular field, right? Application of chemical fertilizers is required in this particular case to obtain higher yields from amended soils, right? And this is the final sort of evidence that I'm going to quote. And this is another beautiful study that Tilak Munasinghe from Agriculture Department, he has conducted in Ambalantota research station with paddy. And he applied different levels of, he applied biochar and compost with chemical fertilizer, CF, in over 5 growing seasons. What he observed is that when you apply only chemical fertilizers or when you apply only the organic fertilizers, and you have lower yields, but you can get a higher yields when you combine both, either biochar and biochar or compost together with chemical fertilizers, right? But the other important thing about this slide is that when you apply biochar, you apply only once, and compost is applied repeatedly in this red line. So meaning every season he has applied, I think, compost, whereas biochar was applied only once. But still, in order to get higher yields, you need to supply biochar with synthetic fertilizers in this particular case, meaning that biochar has not resolved the fertility issue. Even you apply 40 tons of biochar for that particular field, right? So application of chemical fertilizers are important, right? Over to you, Professor Marambe. And I think that is
thank
the
you.
details that
Thank you.
I have given.
Thank you very much, actually, Professor Dharmakeerthi. That was a massive set of information, I must tell you, eloquently presented, chronologically presented as well, had a sequence so that people can understand it very well. Thank you very much for that. We knew what biochar means, whether it's a new technology or not. It's not a solution to all our problems that we have. The diversity matters a lot, even in the case of biochar. And biochar alone will not solve the soil fertility problems. I don't know whether I have already given the answer to the question that I'm going to ask you next, Professor Dharmakeerthi, but it's always good to have it from the horse's mouth. Tell us now, what are the take-home messages from this presentation that you have done? Over to you, Professor Dharmakeerthi.
Right. So when the Alumni Association was first invited me to do a presentation, I had this thing in mind, and in several forums we have been come across with the idea that biochar is a miracle and wonderful product, and once you apply it, it will solve every problem in soil fertility, and you can simply depend only on biochar, right? So it was being sort of put forward in this very infamous organic agriculture era as well. So why don't we apply biochar, and it will be the solution for all our plant nutrient issues that we have with synthetic fertilizers. So as you can very clearly see, I think I have made my point clear that the biochar is highly variable in their properties, and therefore their impact on the soil will be different. That is one. And we have diverse levels of different fertility issues in Sri Lanka, and therefore applying one type of biochar is not going to solve all our problems. As you can see, when we still have not been able to resolve some of the soil fertility issues. That's why we need to apply some additional nutrients to support. Right. So not all fertility problems can be solved. So it is not a panacea for all our soil fertility issues. That is the first one. So the effect vary with the different soil types and the quality of the biochar and the amount that we apply, right? I know that in the recent years, we were trying to apply 1 ton, 2 tons of biochar, or even less than that. For example, for partially burned paddies, we apply only somewhere around 600 kilograms per hectare, right? It is in addition to the normal synthetic fertilizer application, right? But that alone will not provide. Even if we apply 40 tons of biochar, it has not solved the problem. And we still need certain other nutrients in some other forms to make the ratios balanced for optimum growth of plant, right? Therefore, biochar is a very good product, very good technology, and we need to use it knowing the limitations of it. And therefore, we need some smart biochar biochar technologies for specific problems that we have. We cannot solve all problems in one place by applying one type of biochar, but we can target what is the most important fertility issue, and then we can design a biochar material to at least to partially or completely solve that particular issue. So that is the final idea. And I must, before I conclude, I must acknowledge that some of these data, not some, I mean almost all these data, I got it from one of my graduates, several of my graduate students, and I need to acknowledge, and in fact, I wanted to acknowledge their contribution at the very beginning, but I think in the mishap of my slides, I missed that. So some of these data were from Amrita Lojanan, Tilak Munasinghe, Gayani Ratnayaka and Dilani Ratnayaka, Lakshita Lograsa, and Nilum Jayaratne, and Nirasha Upekshani. So I acknowledge their contribution for giving me the opportunity to quote their work, graduates' work, for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dharmakeerthi. And it's looked like quite a large number of people have joined hands with you in developing this very important piece of information, scientifically valid information about biochar and its practical uses as well. Professor Dharmakeerthi, some strange thing happened. All of a sudden, my internet connection broke down and I lost the content of the chat box. But I still remember a few questions that were asked by people. So I'm really sorry if I do not mention your name, but I will put forward those questions to you, Professor Dharmakeerthi. Due to time limitation, I may limit myself to 2-3 questions as far as I remember. The first question I saw was that whether biochar affects beneficial microorganisms. And the question also continues saying that whether biochar has a negative impact or some beneficial impact on the beneficial microorganisms uniformly across borders. Over to you, Professor Dharmakeerthi.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question. And whether the biochar has very negative or positive across the board impacts on beneficial microorganisms, or so that is the question. One thing is clear that we have observed, not we have, people, I haven't worked with microorganisms yet. People have observed that the microbial activity has been improved because of the biochar application. I think that is in general, it is the case, unless otherwise you apply very extremely high quantities of biochar that will affect the pH and therefore their presence in the soil. So if you apply 0.5% to 1%, maximum of 2% of biochar. So that is when we talk about maximum of 40 tons per hectare. Most of the biochars will have a beneficial effect on microorganisms, right? But if you go beyond that, then there can be, because of the changes in pH, that is in one hand. And on the other hand, biochar has some chemicals present in, depending on the way that you produce biochar, right? For example, if you produce biochar at very high temperatures, you have polyaromatic hydrocarbons present in there, right? And some of these can negatively impact some of the organisms in the soil, right? So depending on the type of biochar that you produce, right, and also your original material that you use for the biochar production, you can have some negative impacts as well. But in the bulk, so people recommend to produce biochar for soil application somewhere around 300 to 500 degrees Celsius, within which temperature people have not reported very adverse effects on beneficial microorganisms or the microorganisms in general. But there can be some issues in the diversity of the microorganisms because it changes the nature of the pH and therefore the diversity. But overall in activity, and the beneficial microorganisms. And that is not the case when you use right type of biochar at right rates in most of the soils.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Dharmakeerthi. There's another question. It's coming from Anand and Udapitiya. The question is, are there any possible negative effects on soil properties when you consider biochar? Over to you.
Right. Yeah. One of the very negative impact is that if you apply very high pH material, biochar is of around 10, for example, a pH of 10, somewhere around that. When you apply them in large quantities again, there's a tendency to increase the pH, and the higher increase in pH sometimes can be 1 or 1.5 units higher than the normal soil pH. And if you apply those materials to a soil that are in near neutral or at that pH, then you will be pushing your pH to more alkaline situations. And in that situations, then there will be a negative impacts on the crop growth, as well as in environmental point of view, if you use some fertilizers together with it, for example, urea, right? And that is the first thing. And then also on some of the microorganisms who convert some of these nutrients, like for example, nitrification, the nitrosomonas and nitrobacter bacteria, and they will their performance will be reduced if you apply biochar at very or near neutral or alkaline soils, right? Therefore, in most of the places where these technologies have been studied in the western part of the world, where the pH are kind of near neutral or somewhere slightly alkaline, and they do not apply a lot of biochar into these soils. But when you have a soil with acidic conditions, having biochar application have a beneficial effect, right? So that is the first one. And then the other one is, as I mentioned, that if you have prepared biochar at very high temperatures and you have polyaromatic hydrocarbons present in it, and those things can be harmful and even carcinogens for if you or animals consume them, right? Therefore, that is that issue that has been discussed. But again, as I previously mentioned, when you prepare them at right temperatures and if you apply them in right quantities, and the effect is minimal, right? And so those are some of the two issues. The other issue that that can happen in a negative way is that when you have very high charge surfaces applying at very high rates, and there can be some plant nutrients, for example, can bound to biochar surfaces, like let's say copper and zinc, for example. Their bioavailability can be changed, and copper and zinc are very important micronutrients, and we have seen that in certain soils this has been happened, and but not in the other soils. So we have not come to a consensus yet that the application of biochar has negatively affected the micronutrient availability. But bioavailability of heavy metals, for example, in the soil, that has been reduced, and it has been proven, and biochar is being used as an amendment to contaminated soils to reduce their bioavailability of potentially toxic heavy metals.
Thank you very much, Professor Dharmakeerthi. There are a lot of questions coming up. So I think we have to stop receiving questions on the interest of the time and to leave it what we have at this particular moment. There's a question from Mr. Amila, posted by our secretary, Dr. Duminda Vidanakamage. The question is that you said that biochar has a high amount of potassium. The question is it because biochar has a little bit of ash in it, or it is changing with the raw materials that have been used to produce biochar? This is about the potassium content. Over to you.
Right. What happens is when you use any organic material and when you heat treat it, it will remove some of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and therefore it reduces the weight. But the metals or the cations will remain. They will not be evaporated. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, like nutrients or elements, will be removed from the original material, but they will be now concentrated in the remaining solid material. That is the first reason why it is higher in the biochar material, right? I hope that I made it clear.
Yeah,
and when you have a very high ash content, it means that the concentration of material is in the ash component now. And when you have things like potassium in the ash, they are readily available, right? And therefore, they will be more available than the potassium that is present in the biochar structure, right?
Yes.
Even in the biochar structure, those potassium are about 75% or close to that is water soluble and released to the environment. So it is because of the getting concentrated at the expense of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That is how you end up with higher potassium concentrations in the material biochar.
Thank you very much, Professor Dharmakeerthi. That was very clear. There's a question from Nilusha. There's a question from Nilusha who want you to explain a little bit about the nutrient releasing ability of biochar. And her question is focused to say that whether it is suitable to be used for short duration crops. Over to you.
Short answer. Very quickly. And when you look at the nutrient composition, if you follow the table of characteristics of biochar, so potassium, calcium, and magnesium are the most abundant plant nutrients in it. And other than that, there will be some phosphorus present in it. But potassium, calcium, and magnesium are readily soluble in water, and they are mostly present in the ash fraction, and therefore they will be readily available for plant uptake. But phosphorus, that is not the case, and phosphorus there will be in the biochar structure. There will be a small quantity in the ash component, but that has to be converted into plant available forms before the plant will take up it. But when we apply biochar, phosphorus uptake has been often seen increase. It is because of the other processes that takes place after biochar application, like microbial activity, vesicular-arbuscular mycorrhizae associations are increased, and things like that, right? So cations, like plant nutrients, they will be readily available, and they are the most available nutrients in biochar.
Yep, thank you. There's a comment made by Professor Ranjit Mapa, but I will use that comment to end this presentation after asking you a few more questions. Now, Mahesh Dhammika Rupasingha is the one who actually asked the question with respect to these microorganisms at the beginning. What you want to know is that, very straightforward, what proportion of carbon in the biochar can be utilized by the fungi? Over to you.
Usually, when the biochar has carbon, from the total weight, about 75 to 80% of that carbon is more aromatic type of carbon, which are not easily decomposable. We call recalcitrant carbon. About 5% of the carbon present in biochar is decomposable, and they are in the form of volatile material as well. So these carbon will be accessible by microorganisms, and I am not very familiar with how much of that easily decomposable carbon will be accessible by the fungi when compared to bacteria, for example. That part I'm not very sure about as a proportion. That all depends on the diversity and the community in the soil once we apply, right? If you have a fungal dominated situation, then they will be accessed by fungi, and if there's a bacterial dominated community in the soil, then more of that easily decomposable carbon will be accessible by bacteria. So, but that relative proportion depends on the soil properties and the microbial diversity in the area.
Yeah, thank you very much. Kavintini asked a question from you, Prof. Dharmakeerthi. I'm sure the answer can be long, but expecting a very short answer for this. Now, Kavintini's question is that due to co-pyrolysis of plastic substances, whether there's a chance of adding toxic metals to soil. Over to you.
Okay. Co-pyrolysis with the, so that has been a technology that has been, now people are investigating. I'm not very familiar with the subject, but I know that people are trying to use some plastic material and pyrolyze it together with the raw materials like organic materials, and try to sort of recycle it in the soil situations. But it can be either that depends on what the pyrolysis process that you adopt, right? So there are flash pyrolysis, for example, and they will be converting all the carbon into some form of carbon that has not been accessible for microorganisms or even decompose, right? And there are certain other types of pyrolysis reactions, or the thermochemical reactions, that will break up this carbon material in the plastics so that they will be biodegradable. So I think that is a very new kind of branch of biochar and uses of biochar technology to recycle some of the plastics. And I think there are quite a lot of research going on in the Korean in Korea, and particularly Dr. Avanti Igalavithani is the one who was studying this. And I know that in Jawadhanpur University, there's one Surani Chaturika. She is also doing some research on it. To be frank, I have not particularly studied on this, the availability of toxic material from plastics when you co-pyrolyze with biochar.
Thank you. It's very clear. Thank you very much. There are people who have done that work. Definitely, we can refer to their work as well. Rajita Veerakon asked a question to know whether there's any possibility of improving diseases under wet conditions after application of biochar. Any such incidences, Prof. Dharmakeerthi?
Whether the incidences of diseases increase.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Usually, when we apply biochar, biochar has high pH, and therefore, usually when we apply biochar, biochar increases the pH in the soil, as you evident from one of my slides. Yeah. And when you increase the pH, it has been used in some situations to control pathogens. Mm-hmm. Because some of these microorganisms love acidic conditions. Yep. When you change that pH, in fact, people are trying to use, for example, I know that some people in Rubber Research Institute, they are trying to use applying biochar and see whether it can be a remedy to control white root disease in rubber plantations, for example, by changing the pH of the soil. So it can reduce the disease incidences rather than increasing it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is the last question, but as I told you, I'm going to end up with a comment made by Professor Mahapad. This question is from Namal Dhammika. And the question is that there are things that we have seen that when you grow plants or material in polythene buckets, people apply sometimes more than 25% of the weight or by volume biochar. The question is it okay or not? So in other words, 25%, 1/4 of the material is going to be biochar. Is it healthy or not? Professor Dharmakeerthi?
Okay, that again depends on how much it will change in terms of pH and how much it will change in the cation exchange, in cations present in that soil. For example, and when we use coir dust, for example, and coir dust, the water retention properties can be improved by increasing the biochar content in it. But when you use those type of mixtures, coir dust with biochar and in those materials, then you need to flush and remove the cations like calcium and magnesium in the biochar, so that you will have a better environment for plant to grow. So you can use high amount of biochar, but you need to be very conscious about how much of cations will be present and remain in the soil, and what it will have, the application rate of biochar will have on the cell electrical conductivity level of the material that you are using. So if you can remove them by washing, of course you can go for 25% biochar in a potting media. But you need to be monitor your potting media before you plant anything in it.
Exactly. Thank you very much for that. So, Professor Dharmakeerthi, time is now 8:30. We have spent about 1.5 hours. Of course, there was a short break with respect to technical glitches, but then still, it's a very useful exercise, a very useful seminar, I must tell you. When I look at the comments, when I look at the commendations that are being given by the participants, and that provide adequate proof. Let me end up this webinar by quoting what Professor Ranjit Mahapaya said at the end. He says, even if there is a lot of research and publications on biochar, in his opinion, he sees very limited applications with respect to farmers who are using them. And his opinion, he clearly says that we all need to address this issue. Why farmers are not using it when compared to lots of beneficial research findings are in. So a lot of things to be done, a lot of materials on the cards, and a lot of work has to be focused, more coherent, and to make sure this material can be used effectively as and when possible and where possible, not to do it in an ad hoc manner, but understand the science behind it. That's exactly what Professor Dharmakeerthi was mentioning a little while ago. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us. This is a seminar series or webinar series that we have in fortnight intervals, once in every 2 weeks. And this year we had a specialist in the case of in soil science who's talking about biochar. And we are really happy, Professor Dharmakeerthi, Saman Dharmakeerthi,
thank you,
professor attached to Department of Soil Science, for being with us today to provide extremely useful information, clearing out myths, bringing in facts, clearing out doubts. That's the most important part for the progression of science. So thanks once again, Professor Dharmakeerthi, on behalf of the Alumni Association of Faculty of Agriculture. And thank you very much, colleagues, for being with us. And see you again in 2 weeks' time at 7 p.m. for another webinar series from Alumni Association of Faculty of Agriculture, University of Peradeniya. Have a good night.
Good night.